All right, everyone, we are going to go ahead and get started. I do want to welcome you to the Harris County Flood Control District's virtual community engagement meeting to discuss the Boudreau Stormwater Detention Basin project. This virtual community meeting is being offered by the Flood Control District to share vital information with the community. My name is Sheldra Brigham. I'm with the Flood Control District's communications team. I'm joined tonight by a team of Flood Control District leadership and subject matter experts to ensure we continue to keep you up to date on these important flood mitigation projects in your community. And we're also joined by staff from area elected officials' offices and community associations. We're glad to see the community so engaged in these projects, and we look forward to continuing to share updates and keeping you all in the community involved. First, we would like to begin tonight's meeting with remarks from Harris County Precinct 4 Commissioner Jack Cagle.
Good evening. I'm Jack Cagle, and I have the privilege of serving as the Commissioner of Harris County Precinct 4. I'd like to thank the hardworking team at the Harris County Flood Control District for their tireless efforts to protect you and I, those of us who live in Harris County, from the threats of future flooding. I also want to thank you for taking time out of your valuable evening to participate in this meeting. Your continued input and involvement will make sure that our community remains strong and healthy. The matters that we will discuss this evening will focus on the Willow Creek and Boudreau Stormwater Detention Basin project. These improvements will help preserve our wildlife and continue to make this a wonderful place to work, to play, to visit our families, and to have our bees. Again, your engagement tonight is important to all of us at Harris County Precinct 4 and is a crucial part of successful operations of the Harris County Flood Control District. Thank you for your participation.
And thank you, Commissioner Cagle. We appreciate you joining us for tonight's meeting. Now, this virtual public meeting will begin with a presentation to share project updates, including an overview of the Boudreau Stormwater Detention Basin, the project timeline, and next steps. The presentation will be followed by a virtual question and answer session with Flood Control District team members. Attendees will be able to submit comments and questions through the website or by phone. And any comments not addressed during the Q&A session will receive a response from the Flood Control District after the close of the comment period. Now, instructions on how to participate in this virtual meeting are included on this slide. They're on the virtual meeting webpage, and they're also on the Flood Control District's website. And I'll also share a reminder of these instructions when we reach the Q&A portion of tonight's meeting. We will now transition to Gary Bezemek, Manager of the Feasibility Studies Department. He's going to share more information about the Flood Control District and then more about this project. Gary, over to you.
Thank you, Sheldra, and a special thanks to each of you for joining us. In this presentation, we will give a brief overview of this project. But before we get to the project specifics, we want to share some information about the Flood Control District. The Harris County Flood Control District is a special purpose district that was created by the Texas legislature in 1937 in response to devastating floods that hit the Houston area in 1929 and 1935. The Flood Control District is governed by the Harris County Commissioners Court and works closely with other entities in our region, such as the Harris County Engineering Department and the City of Houston. The organization was created in part to serve as a local partner to leverage federal funding for flood damage reduction projects. Our mission has expanded since our founding, leading to billions of dollars in federal, state, and locally funded infrastructure improvements in the ground. The Flood Control District's mission is to provide flood damage reduction projects that work with appropriate regard for community and natural values. One of the most difficult challenges we face is constructing effective projects that are sensitive to community and natural values in a highly urbanized area. Harris County includes 22 main watersheds, totaling approximately 1,800 square miles and more than 2,500 linear miles of channel. 2,500 miles is approximately the distance from New York to California. A watershed is a geographical region of land that drains to a common channel or outlet. Each watershed has its own unique characteristics and needs. The project we are presenting tonight is in the Willow Creek watershed that is located in unincorporated Precinct 4 of Harris County. Why is Harris County flood prone? Well, our area is flood prone for several reasons, and here are some of the reasons why. Our area experiences extreme rainfall, including tropical storms and hurricanes. Our area is very flat with slow draining land, and our area's underlying soils are clay soils that do not soak up excess rainfall quickly. While the Flood Control District plays a critical role in flood risk reduction, we are one of several entities involved in these efforts in our region. When rain falls on your roof, it flows through several jurisdictions, such as streets and drains managed by the Harris County Engineering Department, a municipal utility district, or MUD, or a city, such as the City of Houston, before it flows into a larger channel, creek, or bayou that the Flood Control District owns and maintains. This slide illustrates the various jurisdictions, which sometimes we even share with other entities. Inside neighborhoods, as shown on the left side of this illustration, storm sewers and roadside ditches collect stormwater runoff and start the process of moving it away from streets and homes. Storm sewers and roadside ditches are the responsibility of the underlying municipality. The larger bayous and channels that take the collected stormwater and move it through our drainage system to Galveston Bay are the responsibility of the Flood Control District. This is shown on the right side of the illustration. In the middle is a stormwater detention basin, sometimes constructed by the Flood Control District. When storm sewers on the left are increased, this creates an increase in runoff. Since it is our policy to avoid impacts to properties downstream, detention basins help to safely take in and temporarily store excess stormwater during heavy rain events. Often, we partner with Harris County precincts, utility districts, and others to add recreational amenities, such as trails to these basins and along our channels. On August 25th, 2018, Harris County voters approved $2.5 billion in bonds for flood risk reduction projects. This vote followed a series of meetings across Harris County in each watershed, which resulted in a list of what are now 181 bond projects. As of August 25th, 2021, every project included in the 2018 bond program has been initiated, including all 7 projects in the Willow Creek watershed. A total of more than $1.35 billion in partnership funding has been secured so far to stretch the 2018 bond program even further. The actual timing of each individual project will depend on a variety of factors, including environmental permitting, right-of-way acquisition and utility relocation, and in some cases, requirements of a particular grant. That said, project lists and projected schedules are updated regularly on our website. While the bond was for $2.5 billion, the full cost of every project on the bond table is almost $5 billion. So we made it clear from the outset that we would need funding partners to fully construct the projects in the bond program. As I mentioned, we have had some successes so far, having secured more than $1.35 billion in partner funds. This graphic illustrates the many sources of those partnerships, including federal, state, and local funding that the Flood Control District is working to secure for Harris County. Each agency has its own definition of eligible projects and its own requirements for local match funding. So the Flood Control District works diligently to match projects to the right partnership opportunities. We will now move into the part of the program that is specifically about the Willow Creek watershed and the Boudreau Stormwater Detention Basin project. I want to first give a brief overview of the Willow Creek watershed and a recent study of this area. The Willow Creek watershed is in the north region of Harris County. It is mostly unincorporated and it includes the southern portion of the city of Tomball. The watershed area is approximately 54 square miles, which includes 56 miles of open streams. The eastern half of the watershed is forested, but includes portions of significant development. The western half of the watershed is primarily rural with open pasture land, but it is developing rapidly. The watershed has a continual history of flooding. Earlier this year, the Flood Control District completed the Willow Creek Watershed Planning Study, which looked at flooding issues across Willow Creek watershed and recommended projects to reduce flooding risks. Planners for this study worked with the Harris County, municipalities, and other agencies to clarify flooding issues and to improve coordination between Flood Control District regional projects and future local projects. Out of all the major flooding events over the last several years, Hurricane Harvey caused the most damage in Willow Creek watershed, with more than 500 homes flooded in this storm. The watershed study determined that the best strategies for addressing flooding issues in this area included selective clearing of trees and other vegetation from Willow Creek, multiple stormwater detention basin construction, and floodplain preservation to prevent further development in the floodplain. In addition to the stormwater detention project that we are discussing tonight, we want to let you know that the Flood Control District is also moving ahead separately with the recommended selective clearing project. This project includes approximately 11 miles of the main stem of Willow Creek, from the confluence of Willow Creek and Spring Creeks to the Burlington Northern Railroad. Selective clearing involves removing non-native and undesirable vegetation, grasses, shrubs, vines, trees, etc., along an overgrown channel. This practice helps maintain or restore the channel's ability to convey stormwater and promotes the growth of desirable species. The goal of selective clearing is to ensure proper stormwater conveyance while promoting a more native shade canopy that will require minimal maintenance. There will be more on this future activity on our website as planning for the project progresses. We also want to give credit to our partners in funding the Willow Creek Watershed Planning Study, which recommended both the Boudreau and the selective clearing projects. Our funding partners included the Texas General Land Office and the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development through the Community Development Block Grant, or CDBG program. This CDBG program was enacted to provide for disaster recovery and restoration of infrastructure for communities impacted by Hurricane Harvey. So, after the watershed planning study identified stormwater detention basins as a best strategy to address flooding in the area, it examined multiple sites for potential projects. Several were recommended for further study. A basin somewhere within the drainage area of Willow Creek tributary M120-00-00, which is outlined here in pink, scored the highest in potential benefits. So the Flood Control District is getting started here with the proposed Boudreau Basin. Further study will help set the specific boundaries for a basin in this drainage area, refine the basin design and layout for maximum stormwater storage, and it will coordinate with the proposed Holderheath Road extension across Willow Creek. The watershed study also recommended initiating property acquisition as soon as possible to preserve a basin site and to allow for the design and construction stages in the future. The proposed Boudreau Stormwater Detention Basin project site is located in unincorporated Harris County. It is named for a nearby roadway. The proposed project area lies generally along the main stem of Willow Creek, just north of State Highway 99 and Boudreau Road. Bond ID F-106 provides $15 million that will fund engineering and construction of the Boudreau Stormwater Detention Basin, which the Flood Control District formally identifies as basin number M500-10-00. In addition, Bond ID F-36 provides property acquisition funding for both Boudreau and the Selective Clearing project. So what is a stormwater detention basin, and really what is its purpose? Stormwater detention basins reduce flooding risks by temporarily taking in and holding excess stormwater during heavy rain events and slowly releasing the stormwater back to the adjacent channel through an outfall pipe when the threat of flooding has passed. Stormwater detention basins come in two basic types, wet bottom and dry bottom basins. A wet bottom stormwater detention basin, shown in the example on the left, has a permanent pool of water which helps with aesthetics and water quality. A dry bottom stormwater detention basin is designed to drain dry after the event, like the example on the right. Each alternative allows for potential partnerships with other local entities that may wish to build recreational amenities such as trails. While the Flood Control District does not build these features, we do coordinate with entities that do, so that when possible, our facilities can support both flood risk mitigation and recreation. Many factors go into deciding what type of stormwater detention basin to build at a particular site, including the amount of the available land, environmental constraints, and many other factors. I will note that the alternatives for this project have not been finalized, nor has a recommended project been developed. That will come later. As a reminder, the purpose of this first meeting is to share background information on the project so far and gain feedback from you. Let's talk in more detail about how stormwater detention basins work. As I mentioned, each is unique in design, but generally they all include an excavated area for temporary stormwater storage, a connection to allow rising stormwater from a nearby bayou or drainage channel to enter the basin, and an outlet pipe that allows the stormwater to drain slowly back to the bayou or channel after a storm. Working in conjunction with stormwater conveyance improvements, basins can mitigate for increased stormwater flow to prevent flooding impacts downstream. They can also hold excess stormwater during rain events. In this slide, you see stormwater levels rising in the channel and the basin providing temporary storage to reduce the risk of stormwater overflowing the channel banks. As stormwater levels recede after the storm event, stormwater stored in the basin will drain slowly back into the channel and continue downstream. So what are the next steps for the project, and where do we go from here? The Boudreau Stormwater Detention Basin project is now in what we call the preliminary engineering stage. Preliminary engineering is an important stage in the development of a project in which we conduct a detailed evaluation of different basin alternatives. This is where the Flood Control District balances the two parts of its mission, providing flood damage reduction projects that work with appropriate regard for community and natural values. During this stage, Flood Control District engineers conduct investigations from several engineering disciplines. These disciplines include environmental reviews and soil studies, extensive boundary and topographic surveys, and hydrologic modeling that is used to show us the projected benefits of the project. Preliminary engineering will also provide the Flood Control District with guidance on future right-of-way acquisition. Alternatives for the project will be evaluated based on performance metrics that include feasibility of construction, cost effectiveness, environmental impacts, and flood risk reduction benefits. As I just mentioned, the Boudreau Stormwater Detention Basin project is currently in the early preliminary engineering stage. During this stage, the engineers determine alternatives for the project and then a single recommended alternative that best meets our flood risk reduction goals. Ultimately, at the conclusion of this project stage, one single alternative for developing the site will be recommended in a document called the Preliminary Engineering Report, or sometimes referred to as a PER. Before we finalize the preliminary engineering report, we will present alternatives to the public in another community engagement meeting, probably in the spring of 2022. At this future community engagement meeting, we will share more detailed information about the recommended alternative, as well as development of a preliminary conceptual design. We will also have more information about a tentative project timeline, assuming funding is available. Once the preliminary engineering report is approved, and assuming the project continues as expected, it would then move into the detailed design stage, with construction tentatively scheduled to follow. I will now turn the program back over to Sheldra to kick off the question and answer session.
All right, thank you, Gary. Before we get to the Q&A session, I do want to share a quick reminder that we would love to hear from you on this and other projects that are moving forward across Harris County. To learn more about this project, to ask questions, and to sign up for our mailing list, please visit hcfcd.org/F106. Now, as a reminder, there are 3 ways to submit a comment about this project during tonight's meeting. You can submit a comment on this slide in the box near the presentation live stream. You can submit a comment on the Flood Control District's website. That's hcfcd.org/F106. Or you can submit a comment via phone. And that number is 855-925-2801. You'll want to utilize the meeting code 4731. And if you are joining us via phone tonight, please press star to leave a message. Additionally, I do want to reiterate that any questions not addressed during tonight's Q&A will receive a response from the Flood Control District following the close of the comment period. Now, information from this meeting and a recording of the live stream will be available on the Flood Control District's website as well as our YouTube channel. Now, joining Gary for our Q&A session tonight is Zafar Ahmed, Project Manager for the Boudreau project. And now it's time to take some of your questions. First question will be for Gary. And Gary, what is the difference between a feasibility study and preliminary engineering?
Yes, Sheldra. Really the difference, if you want to almost think of it as a funnel in a way, when we start a feasibility study, in general, we're starting to go to a particular study area. And our goal of the feasibility study is to identify what the problems are in that study limit, and then come up with alternatives, different things that could be done that would provide benefit to the area. So when we're doing a feasibility study, there's really kind of, reasonably speaking, there's an unlimited number of concepts that can be done because we're starting with a clean slate. We know that the area has experienced flooding, but we have to figure out what's going on. We have to identify where the worst of the flooding is, and then we have to come up with different alternatives and options. So as we complete the feasibility study, we then take the projects that we've identified or the concepts, and we identify which of those make the most sense to move forward. So when we go to the preliminary engineering phase, they are now focused down on 1 or 2 projects that we have said, these look very promising. And then they take those and they put in a lot more detail. Instead of studying the entire watershed and looking at all these different what ifs, they now are focused on 1 or 2 alternatives. And in that process, they have to start looking at a lot of more specific details that we don't look at feasibility, such as, what are the pipeline situations? What's the environmental factors on these different sites? And so they start refining the process down to getting a much more detailed cost estimate and an idea of what it would take to do the project. And as we move forward in the timeline, we're just focusing more and more down to a specific design. And then ultimately, if funding is available, it goes to construction. And then once it's constructed, we have long-term maintenance operations that take over. So that in a nutshell is what we're doing is, we're going from a high level to a specific project and then refining that project until we have something that can be taken out and actually constructed.
Thank you, Gary. Our next question is for Zafar. What is the status of this project?
Good evening, everybody. My name is Zafar. I'm the project manager of this project. This project is at early preliminary engineering stage. After feasibility stage, it comes to us, the project management group, And the first step here is preliminary engineering. And after the preliminary engineering, we recommend the best alternatives for the project. Then it goes to final design. And then after final design, it goes to construction. So during preliminary engineering study, our engineer will study at least 3 alternatives to meet the goal of this project. So in order to study the alternatives, we are gonna do the soil study, geotechnical boring, environmental study to determine if there are any environmental factors, any environmental limitations like the wetlands area we won't be able to use. So we'll have to compensate that body. And also our engineer is gonna do H&H analysis to determine the benefits and a required volume calculation to meet the goal of this project. So based on all additional services and H&H studies, we are gonna study 3 alternatives, and we are gonna recommend 1 alternative based on the environmental factor and estimated cost. And during that time, we are gonna have our second public engagement meeting, and we are gonna present our alternatives and also recommended alternatives to the public for their input. And we are gonna take their input and incorporate in our recommendations. So currently the project is at its early stage, at the early preliminary engineering stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Safar. Our next question will be for Gary. And how much will this project reduce flood levels in the Willow Creek watershed?
Yes, the project is expected to reduce flood levels. Well, I should add that this project that we're talking about, and as a reminder, is the detention basin near the Boudreau Road area. But from the flood control district's perspective, it's being done in combination as part of a bigger plan that also includes the selective clearing that we talked about. So when the selective clearing and the detention basin are put together, based on our feasibility study, we were seeing reductions at the 100-year event, which is around 16 inches and 24 hours of rainfall in the watershed over the entire watershed. We were seeing reductions anywhere from between 3 inches to about a foot at the 100-year. And our expected benefits are somewhere on the order of 100 to 150 homes that would be pulled out. They would no longer be a threat at a risk to flood during the design storm, that 100-year that we were evaluating. A lot of other homes, there's several hundred that would experience reduced flooding if they would flood at all. So depending on the elevation of the homes, they're all going to experience either a benefit or be removed from the flooding. But we're looking at somewhere in that 100, 150 number of homes, and flood elevations dropping anywhere from 2 to 3 inches at a minimum within the study limits to about a foot.
Thank you, Gary. Next question is for you as well. Can you describe more about what a stormwater detention basin looks like?
Yeah, if we could maybe go back to one of the graphics. A detention basin is really, we call them a detention basin. Smaller ones may be called ponds by others, but basically it's a excavated area that is designed to fill up and hold stormwater. There's different ways these basins can be designed in terms of what they look like. They can be a dry bottom, they can be a wet bottom. Each one of those brings in different considerations. A dry bottom is ideal for if it's a big enough basin that maybe ball fields or recreational components can be on the bottom of the basin. Oftentimes, some of these basins may only fill up and 10, 20 times a year. So the rest of the year, a dry bottom basin can provide recreational benefits. A wet bottom, though, is more aesthetic sometimes. There's tree planting, or excuse me, wetland plantings that can be put on the bottom. And sometimes it's a different scenic kind of view. But the function of both of those types of basins is really to hold stormwater. And there's different things that they can be done. They can be designed for different purposes, but oftentimes what we're trying to do is excavate the top bank of the channel so that when the water levels get above a certain elevation, water will spill out of the channel and go into the basin. And so we set a weir or a structure that we can target when the water will leave. So if you get 2 or 3 inches and the water is just a foot deep in the channel, the basin may only get just what fell on it or drained to it from around it. But when you start getting to the top of the channel bank, then that's where we start to look at, okay, can we design a structure so that the water will spill over, fill up the basin, and that excess stormwater doesn't have to be going down the channel. And that results in lower flows in the channel and a reduced floodplain. When we combine that concept of detention with selective clearing, we then increase or restore, I should say, the capacity of Willow Creek back to what it would have held if not for a lot of the vegetation that's blocking the flows. So you get more capacity in the channel going downstream, and then we try to divert water off. And as a reminder, the plan that we've developed for Willow Creek includes multiple detention sites. It's just at this point in time, we're starting with the detention basin that scored the highest. And so our long-term plan would be to build additional stormwater detention and design it so that we can reduce the flooding and the flows when you have these extreme events over the entire watershed.
Thank you, Gary. I do want to share a quick reminder. We're a little bit over the halfway mark. Want to remind you there are 3 ways that you can submit a comment about this project during tonight's meeting. You can submit a comment on the site near the presentation live stream. You can submit a comment on the Flood Control District's website, hcfcd.org/F106, or you can submit a comment via phone, that number 855-925-2801. You'll want to utilize the meeting code 4731. And if you are joining us via phone tonight, you'll press star to leave a message. Additionally, I want to remind you that any questions that we don't get to during tonight's Q&A session will receive a response from the Flood Control District following the close of the comment period. Information from tonight's meeting, as well as a recording of the live stream, that's going to be available on the Flood Control District's website, and you'll also be able to find that on our YouTube channel. And now we will get back to some of your questions that have come in. Next question will be for Safar. Will there be trails and other recreational features around this basin?
Thank you, Sandra. Even though the flood control district does not build or maintain any trails or other recreational amenities, we allow those trails and recreational amenities in our design. We can leave space for those features. So what we do, we discuss with the precinct, other community partners, City of Houston, parks and departments, for their any planned or future trails or amenities. And we are going to include that in our design. So in the future, when funding is available, we can build it. So even though we don't build it, we can always put it in our design for future amenities or trails. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's see, our next question will be for Gary. Gary, what is the difference between the M500 project and the M120 project?
Well, I believe that the M500-10 project is the M500-10 is our designation for what we will call the detention basin. The Flood Control District has a naming convention that we apply throughout the county just for accounting purposes, so we can keep track of records and apply records to every specific channel and every specific detention facility. So the M500-10 is what we're going to refer to as the basin itself. And M120-00-00 is the channel that actually drains nearby to where we're trying to locate this detention basin. So in a sense, we could have called this the M120 project, or it could be called the M510 detention basin, but they're basically referring to the same project that we're doing in this particular area.
Thank you, Gary. Next question is for Zafar. How will you, oh, it says hi. Do you know when this will be constructed and if the connection to Champion Forest and Holderreath Road anytime soon?
Thank you, Sheldra. As we mentioned that this project is at its earliest stage for preliminary engineering, and we are expecting our preliminary engineering report will be ready and finalized in middle of the next year, 2022. Then the final design, the next step may take about 12 months. And after the final design, if funding is available, then we can go for construction, and it may take another year or year and a half. So at this stage, we don't know for sure when the construction is gonna be completed or when the construction will begin. And there is another factor, the environmental factor. If the PER determines that we would need individual permit for wetlands delineation, that may delay our construction, because the US Army Corps of Engineers, they take like around 18 months to 1 year to review and approve individual permit for wetlands delineation. So that factor may delay our final design, not final design, our construction, start of the construction. So we don't know if this is too early. During our second community engagement meeting, we are going to have the clear picture about any environmental constraints or any soil conditions or our TNH study recommendations. At that time, we are going to have a clear picture about the projected construction time. Thank you.
And Sheldra, can I
Sure.
just add on to that? Zafar just answered what the timeline is for the detention basin. The selective clearing project is already being moved into the pipeline. We have a standard program for doing selective clearings through our maintenance departments. And so the project is being programmed to go. The only thing that is holding up us starting on it is we need some sections of the Willow Creek. We don't have access to them. And there's some sections for us to clear along the channel. We have to obtain some kind of a property right. We can't just go on private property and do work. So our maintenance side is starting the process of working through the steps it would take to do the selective clearing. And more than likely, the selective clearing portion of the project, which is a separate project, but it came out of the feasibility study, will go probably sooner than we'll see construction on the detention basin happening.
And also for Sheldra, Ben wants to know whether we are coordinating with the Harris County Engineering Department regarding Holderreath Road project. The answer is yes. And we invited them, and they also participate to our monthly progress meeting. We have been sharing information and also the reports like H&H report and also the geotechnical report. So yes, we are in contact with them and coordinating with them with that Holderreath Road project. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question will be for Gary. Gary, how is this project being funded?
The basin design, the PER for the M500-10 basin is totally being funded right now out of our 2018 bond. There were two projects, there were two bond projects that were listed that we're going to be able to take funding from. One of them is, I'm looking down on my notes, one of them is bond project number F-106, which was $15 million to do construction and design activities in Willow Creek. And we also have bond project F-36, which was a $30 million bond project to acquire property detention basin sites for either detention or floodplain preservation. So between the combination of those two bond projects, we're going to be able to fund a good portion of this. I don't know if it'll pay for all of this project, but it should be a good portion of it to get us started.
Thank you, Gary. Next question is for Zafar. Do you know whether this project will pull areas out of the 100 or 500-year floodplain?
Well, it is still too early. We are at the preliminary engineering stage. We'll know during our final design about the exact benefit of the project. And we are gonna see the full benefit after completion of this project and selective clearing project. And also a couple of other projects, feasibility study recommended along the Willow Creek watershed. So this project alone is gonna reduce some flood risk, but we don't know the exact benefit yet. We are gonna know, we are gonna have the more clear in the picture during our final design stage. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question will be for Gary. How will you mitigate the environmental impacts of this project?
Yes, really the way that we do that is we first have to start with identifying what the project will be. So there's sort of a combination of things going on when we're doing the PER. One is we're identifying what the project is so that ultimately we can take the project and apply for whatever relevant permits, environmental permits we have to. But the second thing going on is while we're designing it, we're keeping in mind what the impacts potentially would be to the environment, and we're trying to minimize impacts through our design. So as we're working through the PER, we're gathering information about wetlands, habitat that lives out there, vegetation, all the different things. And as we work through that process and we gain more information, then we have to make decisions on, hey, is the site that we were thinking about at the beginning, would we still want to build the basin, the way that the feasibility study laid it out? And more often than not, during that PER process, preliminary engineering process, the engineers get enough information that they try to find a balance of making sure the project is not overly disturbing the environment, but it's also making it where it's something we can get a permit for and reasonably in a reasonable amount of time be able to do the project. So that's kind of the process. It's sort of circular. We kind of start with a concept and then we refine that concept to come up with something that we think will meet the needs of the project goals, but at the same time be something we can get a permit for. And then ultimately what we do to mitigate is when we go for the permit, if there are certain elements of the environment that are being damaged, we have to work out how we would mitigate that. And there's a lot of different ways of doing that, mitigation banks, tree plantings, things that we do on the back end of the project. So all of that is part of what goes into the PER process.
Thank you, Gary. Next question is for Zafar. Why can't you show the exact location for this project?
Well, as we have discussed that this project is at the preliminary stage, and during the preliminary study, we are gonna study 3 alternatives to meet the project benefit and goal. And based on the 3 alternatives, we are gonna recommend the best alternatives based on our study and the estimated cost and benefits. So at that time, we are gonna know the exact footprint and alignment of the detention basins. So currently we know the general location of the project is located to the north of State Highway 99 and Boudreau Road and along the Willow Creek main stem and in unincorporated Harris County. So during our second public engagement meeting, we should be able to share the exact location of this project. Thank you.
Thank you, Safar. I think you all mentioned alternatives. Why are there multiple alternatives and how do you decide?
Is that for me?
Yeah, for you, Gary, or Safar.
No, I can answer. Really, it starts at the feasibility. And when we talk about alternatives, Zafar's alternatives are maybe a little bit different when we're in the PER process than when I'm referring to an alternative at the feasibility study. But they're very similar. So as we're doing a feasibility study, if you guys can see the map that's showing, when we came into the Willow Creek watershed, we were studying 64, 65 square miles of Willow Creek. So we're trying to determine where do we have flooding problems? What is the source root of the flooding? Is it water spilling out of the channels and flooding? Is it water going overland trying to get to the bayous? Or is it neighborhood type issues with the way the streets are graded and storm sewers or open channels or open roadside ditches? So as we're studying it, we will start developing problem areas or areas that we say, hey, these number of areas throughout the watershed have problems. So then when we start to try to figure out what we can do, at the feasibility side, there's a lot of options. We have a lot of tools in our toolbox. We can put in detention, we can look at channelizing, we can look at maybe building new channels and diverting water. So all of those are really at our level, they're considered an alternative. You know, should we put in a detention basin in this area by itself? Maybe we put the basin upstream of the problem and try to take flows off so it benefits. Or maybe we say, let's look at channelizing and let's put in a bigger channel and let's put a detention basin on the south side of the problem. We also could say maybe we can divert water from one area on this problem area and take it over to a different area. So in the feasibility side, our alternatives are really potentially just totally different concepts. But as we start moving out of feasibility and we start identifying alternatives that work in particular areas, then we go through a process where we score and rank all of these different alternatives to say, okay, which ones provide the most benefits? Which ones do we think would be the most constructible? Which ones would reduce the amount of environmental permitting? And then we settle on a recommended 1 or 2 project areas. So once those recommendations go to the PER team, they are now starting in this case with a detention basin to be located in a specific area. So when they start looking at their alternatives, they're not looking at, should we divert or do something totally different? What they're starting with is there's a basin here, but now their alternatives are, should it be a wet bottom basin? Or maybe it's a dry bottom basin, or maybe it's some combination. So they're starting to do alternative looks at the concept, but they're not going back and saying, well, let's relook at the entire watershed and try to figure out a concept. And so, you know, the alternatives, when we talk about an alternative in the PER, it's really a design element change, or it's a, how can we avoid this environmental constraint? And they come up with various alternatives, kind of like what we did, but their alternatives are variants of a concept of a project. And then ultimately they will come up with something that they would recommend. And then that project, if blessed and there's funding, would continue to work its way down the process, ultimately go into design and then construction. So hopefully that kind of gives an idea of what we're referring to when we talk about an alternative.
And for Safar, will the public have a chance to see the alternatives and give their input?
Shanda, thank you. Yes, our next public engagement meeting is going to be tentatively during spring 2022. And at that time, we are going to have our draft PER with at least minimum 3 alternatives and the recommended alternatives. So at that time, during our meeting, we are going to ask for public input, and we are going to incorporate those public comments, recommendations, and revise our draft PER and finalize it, then answer is yes. Of course, we are gonna share alternatives and the recommended alternative with the public, and also you're gonna seek public inputs and advice. Answer is yes. Thank you.
Thank you. Gary, will M500-10 take overflow out of Willow Creek or some other channel?
Yes, as our feasibility study progressed, the biggest problem that we were seeing within the watershed, the biggest pervasive problem was flooding along the main stem of Willow Creek. So as conceived and laid out in our feasibility study, the M500-10 basin would predominantly be taking overflow water out of Willow Creek main stem and diverting it into this detention facility. And so in doing that, it reduces the amount of flows going down Willow Creek, which directly relates into a lower floodplain, a smaller floodplain limit. And as the future comes and we can build additional basins that are similar to our feasibility plan, the combination of all those basins would be taking water off of the main stem of Willow Creek and trying to reduce the amount of flooding, the water surface elevations for various flood events. And that's where most of the benefits are coming, are along the main stem of Willow Creek.
Another question for you, Gary. How can a basin that has a permanent pool of water hold more water? Isn't it already full?
Oh, that's a great question. The reason that oftentimes a permanent pool of water will result in more volume is that in order for us to drain a basin, to get the water to totally drain out of it, we have to put a slope to the bottom of the basin. And the bigger a basin is and the more it extends away from a channel, the more that the bottom of the basin is going to have to get at a higher elevation. So when we do a permanent pool of a wet bottom basin, we basically can make the bottom of the basin flat and we don't lose any volume because we're having to put in like a pilot channel on the bottom so that the water will all drain out. So if a stormwater detention basin is not properly designed with a good bottom slope, you'll end up with pockets of water and mosquitoes and things like that. So a permanent pool allows us to avoid that, and a permanent pool can be made deep enough where you don't really have mosquito problems. So there's a lot of things that go into the design, but ultimately by making the bottom flat, we're able to get more volume on a larger basin versus having to grade the bottom, so that the furthest point away is at a higher elevation and then that water has to drain. So that's a great question because that's one of the design elements that we have to look at.
All right, one more question for you, Gary. Let's see here. How can a stormwater detention basin improve stormwater quality?
A stormwater detention basin, I think in a very simplified sense, when you get a large rain event, we're talking, where the channels are filling up, that rain water as it runs off through the watershed is picking up debris, it's picking up contaminants like oil, anything that was on the road. And so the best way to get that out of the water is to slow the water down and let it sit for a while so that that material can settle out. So the purpose of a stormwater detention basin with water quality features typically is to have a path that the regular rainfall, the 2 year, 1 year regular, will be able to get into an area where it will sit for enough time that everything in it can settle out. And in conjunction with plantings, water quality plantings, there's plants that we can put into the bottom that will help clean up the water. It takes out some of the oils and those type of things. And so there's an entire side of the engineering that's trying to design based on, what would be in the water to put in plantings, wetland plantings, those type of plantings in the bottom of the basin, and then have a contact time where it stays long enough that that water, when it comes out of the basin, it's going to be cleaner than what actually went into it. So that becomes something that we try to do We typically don't do that at the PER stage because that's starting to get into a lot of little details. And at the, I'm sorry, not the PER, at the feasibility stage. When we're doing feasibility, we're trying to figure out what the project would look like. But as it gets into PER, that's where they start really looking at those details about what could be done and what would it look like and how does that affect the functionality of the basin itself.
Thank you, Gary. Can you talk about any other projects recommended by the Watershed study?
Sure. The overall study that we completed recommended, I don't remember the exact number, but it was 4 or 5 detention basins be built along the main stem of Willow Creek that are within the limits of the selective clearing. So we evaluated what it would take to reduce the floodplain, and we came up with a plan where, in conjunction with the selective clearing, that will allow for more flow to go through the channel. It's kind of restoring the channel capacity back to what it once was. It will also, we would add the detention in. So once we came up with the overall plan, then we had to go back and say, okay, let's see if we just build one basin at a time, what are the individual benefits of each individual basin to try to figure out which basin would perform the best and give us the most benefits, because that's the basin that we want to build first. So the other projects are conceptual, but they're detention facilities that would be built along the main stem, and in conjunction, they would reduce water elevations to the maximum target that is laid out in our study.
All right, thank you so much, Gary. And I do want to let folks at home know how you can find out more about other projects that are happening in the Willow Creek Watershed. You can do that by visiting our website at hcfcd.org/Willow Creek, and you'll select the project of interest from a list on the left side of the webpage. And additionally, each page has a submit a comment button for any questions that you may have or for any input that you want to send us about a particular project. So that can be found on our website. And with that, I'd like to share one final reminder that we will continue to accept comments and feedback on this project through December 17th. So please reach out to us and let us know your comments and questions. And we also want to encourage everyone to get flood insurance, as we know that flood season in Harris County runs year-round. I do want to thank Gary and Safar tonight, and thank all of you for joining us this evening and for all of your engagement on this project. We look forward to continuing to share updates as our work moves forward. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a great evening.